Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that my book, Drummers on Drumming, is available now on Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Based on the Big Fat Five segment of this podcast, where I sit down with my favorite drummers to discuss the 5 records and stories that shaped their approach to the instrument, this book is packed with insights from the drummers who redefined how we think about the modern drum set. You can grab your copy now by checking the link in this episode's show notes or simply searching Drummers on Drumming on Amazon. So thank you for all the support, and now let's get into the show. What is up? Welcome back to Drummers on Drumming, the podcast brought to you by Big Fat Snare Drum, where personal stories, creative insights, and honest discussions collide to celebrate the world of drumming. So today, I'm thrilled to share a conversation with a true force in modern drumming, Ilan Rubin. You've heard his incredible work behind the kit with artists like Nine Inch Nails, Danny Elfman, Angels and Airwaves, Paramore, and so many more. But Ilan is not just an outstanding drummer, he's also a passionate educator, and his latest project proves just that. So he recently released an instructional book called Start Somewhere to Go Somewhere, and in this episode we certainly discuss the book, but we dive deep into Ilan's philosophy on practice and technique in a way that I personally haven't heard him talk about before, and also why he felt compelled to share his unique perspective in an already crowded field of drum education. I have the book, and I've been able to spend more time with it since recording this episode with Ilan, and I can say firsthand, it's worth it. So without further ado, here is my chat with the youngest Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, Ilan Rubin. Cheers. Before we get into the book, I kind of want to ask a question that I've been asking a few drummers on a separate segment called The Drum Panel. And for you, Ilan, what is the most meaningful compliment you could receive as a drummer? You get off stage, someone comes up to you, the first thing they say, what would mean the most to you?
Well, look, that's a very good question because obviously everybody will take any compliment, whether it be like, well, that was exciting to watch. I really enjoyed watching you play. All of that is great, but in terms of, and I'm always appreciative, mind you. I don't want to sound dismissive of that. I'm just trying to get to the actual answer
you
here.
You never get a compliment ever again.
But I suppose it's not after a show, but when people say, "Hey, I watch your videos, or I've seen you play, and I've listened to your recordings, and I have learned so much." That to me means a lot because I think it would mean a lot to any musician because we've all spent a lot of time learning things that we like, whether it's beats or fills or guitar players learning riffs, bass players doing bass lines. Everybody knows the words to their favorite songs, but that goes above and beyond just enjoying something. You want to study something and learn it. And as somebody who loves to do that, generally, I feel that is a deep compliment because it takes a commitment to do that. There's no bullshit there. If somebody says, "I've been learning your stuff," they're putting in time into appreciating you and then learning from you, which is great.
Speaking of education, I mean, if you could go back in time, and I guess with the disclaimer, not be able to give your book to your younger self, but what is one piece of advice about learning and practicing that you would want to have ingrained from the beginning?
Oh, it's a very good question. Now, I may have a left of center answer because as a drummer, I honestly don't have any regrets in terms of the learning process. As a pianist, I do have one colossal regret. And perhaps others can share in this regret as a drummer or any other instrument. But before I get to the actual regret as a pianist, the reason why I don't have regrets as a drummer is because I think it's fantastic to to learn by doing. And this could just be because I'm a drummer, you're a drummer, you'll get where I'm coming from. It seems like the easiest instrument to learn by ear. Now, obviously, when you get into crazy stuff with a billion notes, it's not easy. But if you want to listen to a groove that's just bass drum, hi-hat, snare drum, you can kind of immediately get what's going on and internalize it super quickly. Now, most drummers, I mean, Buddy Rich couldn't read drum notation, and he's the greatest, you know. That may come as a shock. Most people know I'm a Bonham fanatic, but I don't expect Bonham to know how to read music. The fact that Buddy Rich couldn't read is incredible to me. So you don't need to learn how to read music to be a great drummer. And technically, you don't need to know how to read music to become a great musician on any instrument. But personally, by the time I came around to the piano, I taught myself how to read for it based on drum notation. Okay, so I knew the duration of the notes. I got a book, figured out treble clef, bass clef, the grand staff, and I was like, okay, if I just plug in these rhythms on these lines or spaces, I can learn music.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I did, but I didn't have that ingrained sight reading ability that so many kids grow up with and probably don't appreciate till much later in life. And that's something that is frustrating to me, that I try to put in time, at least 10 minutes a day, just trying to learn very simple, uninteresting things just to kind of build that muscle. But I can honestly say, this might come as a sigh of relief to people, I've used reading notation professionally maybe 4 times in my life.
Oh, wow.
You know, I think it's far more important as a working drummer to be able to write your own charts that you understand for a session. You know, if you need to learn something quickly, if you need to have something to jog your memory, I think that's way more important. But the amount of times I've actually had a chart put in front of me, it's probably 4.
Sure.
And it's only ever been film scoring or on a video game that I played on. I played on that Cyberpunk 2077 game, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And that shocked me because I was not expecting to go in and play drums for video game and have them hand me a stack of beats. And I'm like, oh my God, all right, here we go. It's a good tool to have, more so to be able to read at your own pace. You can get a book, you can go through it slowly, and that's great.
So this question, I'm not sure. I'm curious how you're going to take it, and someone who is obviously an educator. Yeah, exactly. No. So how do you think a drummer's mindset and approach to practice has to evolve as they progress from a beginner to a professional?
I think there's a fine line in the answer to that question, and I will elaborate.
Please do.
I've always...
What if you just didn't?
I was like, you know what? I have the answer, but I'm not going to give it to you.
Next one, yeah.
I have always commended the people who've had the discipline to practice for hours and hours a day. I have never been that guy. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't and don't put my time in. But what I think needs to truly be realized for anybody is what works best for them. If you think, okay, I have got an ability for hyper-focusing for 30 minutes to an hour at a time, even if it's less or more, if you know that, then you need to take advantage of that time and get the most you can. Because the reset period to when you can do that again might be a couple of hours. So you're better off splitting up, let's say, your practice or your learning time, which I think are 2 very different things, by the way. I think learning something is being introduced to something obviously you didn't know before. It's very common sense. But practicing is about ingraining it into your body, whether it's muscle memory, understanding it. And those are 2 very different things. And that's also something that should be understood. So I think when you figure out how your personality works as a musician, what makes you tick, then you're off to the races. Because some people can say, oh, you know, I try to practice for 4 hours a day, but I just don't feel like I'm getting enough out of it. And that may be because, yes, you're putting in the time, but you're not internalizing it the way you should because you're not into that level of focus.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that people need to realize what it is that they want to focus on. Now, I felt at the time like I was at a crossroads, okay? Now, obviously, every new musician, it's a cliche. They all want to start shredding, okay?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Guitar players want to shred, bass players want to slap. I still don't understand that one. And drummers play drum solos and get more toms and cymbals. Okay. Now, then that kind of starts to revert. You start focusing more on maybe playing rhythm guitar. You focus more on grooves. You realize you don't want to lug around extra drums and cymbals. And you kind of start minimizing and focusing on what's truly important. So when I got to that point of my drumming life, I realized I'm like, I can start getting a wood block on a pedal or a cowbell and start learning some weird Afro-Cuban 3-4 part polyrhythm stuff, which is incredible. I commend the people who do that. But that's not the kind of music that I was into or playing, right? So I realized, okay, I'd actually rather spend my time getting better at the guitar or learning how to play piano, because those are things, as just a fan of music and songwriting, those are the tools of the trade. So I learned where I should sort of invest my mental resources. When you get to any level of difficulty with an instrument and you master it, and I'm not saying I've mastered anything, but I'm just saying, speaking conceptually here, the next step is to learn something more difficult. And that's a trap that classical pianists fall into, for example. It might be their true passion, but you get into more and more and more difficult pieces and concertos, and that's great if that's what you want to do. But as a drummer, I knew I didn't want to go down that path. And I respect people who do and have, and to each their own, because I do commend sheer ability, whether it's speed or precision. But I guess that then you get into the crossroads of, okay, how much time are you going to invest into speed and precision, or how much time are you going to spend into, say, refining your taste, or thinking about how to utilize the tools you already have and sharpening them in ways that may be more useful? I mean, I don't want this to come across as negative in any way, but like metal drummers, I respect them. They play like machines. I have never, ever, ever had that desire as a drummer. It does not seem fun to me.
Sure.
But I commend them. It's just, what do you want to do?
For sure.
And figuring that out is important.
Well, I do want to now hop into the book, because you're kind of talking about the reason why I was so excited when you first introduced this and talked about it on Instagram was off the top of my head, I can't think of contemporary rock drummers that are so fun to listen to that are doing it nowadays that have books out. So it's awesome to come from a source like you. And so before we get into it, I did want to talk about the fact that you have a foreword from Ronnie Vannucci of the Killers.
One of the greatest guys of all time.
Yes.
I mean that. It just as a human being, he is phenomenal.
Do you think you're a better drummer than he is?
What a horrible question to ask me.
No, but on a serious note, what is the story behind you wanting to have him be your forward?
Honestly, we are good friends, and I am the type of person who hates to bother or inconvenience people.
Sure.
But we're good enough friends to where I said, I need you to do me a favor. And I didn't feel shy about it. I would have been completely understanding if he couldn't do it. But I felt comfortable enough to ask him. He's one of those guys where if he said, hey, I'm in town right now, let's go get a drink, I would get in the car and go, well, I'd call an Uber. Got to do it responsibly.
Of course, absolutely.
But, most people, 99 out of 100, I would definitely make an excuse. I'd say, I got to watch the kid. I'd find a way to not leave the comfort of my home. But for that guy, anything. But we should talk about his playing style, because he's very, very unique.
Let's talk about it, yeah.
I know that's not the theme of this particular podcast, but there's because I didn't grow up listening to the Killers, to be honest with you. He and I became friends completely aside from that whole world. I actually saw him, our friendship began probably about 10 or so years ago, but he was playing with his solo stuff in San Diego.
Oh, Talk, right?
Big Talk.
Big Talk, yeah.
And Brooks Wackerman was playing drums, which was a treat to watch, but I'd played the Casbah a bazillion times. I was still living in San Diego at the time, which is where I'm from, and my brother was actually like, let's just go see what it's all about. He somehow succeeded to drag me out of the house. You could have gathered by now that I am a homebody unless I'm on tour, but I went to the show. It was a great show. but he got off stage, pulled a beer off of his amp, and then just started talking to people on the floor. And we locked eyes, and he's like, I know you. And I was like, I know you. And we've been friends ever since.
He is an incredible drummer. I just saw Cannons was lucky enough to play open for them in Minneapolis a year ago. And it's the first time I saw him. And then I also just saw them in Lollapalooza this last year. He has the ability to seemingly be so busy, but it just always grooves, and it never feels like it's in the way, but he's so awesome.
You're completely right. And you know what it is? He kind of splits himself in two, where he holds down the rhythm, but he then plays off of the vocal.
Sure.
So when he's playing off the vocal, but still laying it down, let's say he's keeping 4 on the floor or whatever it is, he's in and around the beat. But I think that the synchronicity with the vocal makes it work so well. I'm not a Keith Moon fan per se, not to bum anybody out, but I was watching something interesting. It popped up on a Instagram feed or whatever, and it was Roger Daltrey talking about his playing style. And he pointed out that he plays to the vocal. And funny enough, when there is no vocal is the only time he seemingly plays straight. And I thought that was so bizarre. It's incredibly unique. I understand why people are into his style. But I guess I just came more from a kind of laying it down and getting into it style of drumming, locking in with the bass. Stuart Copeland was my first kind of... I mean this in the most loving way, but he plays like he's got ADD, right?
Sure.
And he will not play the same thing twice, ever. Mm-hmm. And I love that about him. But it's not because he's playing off of the vocal. He's just excited to hit whatever's around him.
Yeah.
Ronnie, you can tell, he's kind of going in 2 different rhythmic directions at the same time that is somehow anchored. And I love watching him play. He's so good.
Absolutely. Everyone go see Ronnie play, and I won't give it away, but his forward, it really kind of sets the pace of the book up in a really cool way.
Well, I'm happy that you appreciated that. So Thank you.
Well, so the question, what inspired you to write this instructional book? And what kind of drummer do you feel should go pick up this book? Take it away.
All right. So I will work backwards here, and I'll answer your last question. Because it is very much a rudiments-based book in the sense of how to apply it to the drum set. Because when I say rudiments, I don't want anybody to kind of mentally check out and be like, flamadiddles on a pad, and when am I ever going to use that? Sure. The whole point of the book is here's how you're going to use it. And rudiments do not pertain to any specific genre, of course. So I do think that the exercises are neutral enough and varied enough that somebody can say, ooh, you know what? I can pull this and I can use it there. And the material is also meant to be, look, you can dice it up and you can use it as fills. You can take full phrases and use it as a sort of platform to launch off of for a solo. And that inspiration came from, I already mentioned Buddy Rich. He's certainly one of my favorites, but he and Joe Morello, which we talked about the last time we did this,
yes,
but those guys opened me to that world of being able to take finesse, creativity, taste, and speed and apply it to the drums, and it's all based on rudiments. And it's so powerful and it's so versatile that is something that has stuck with me since I was probably, in my early teens for sure. So that coupled with me genuinely and generally being a lover of books, whether they're music books, history books, I just love books. And to me, the book is it's a culmination of knowledge. And I've just always had a lot of respect for the written word and somebody who puts that effort in. So as somebody who has a ton of books and has always appreciated finding out what's inside of them, it's just something I always wanted to do. This is an idea that I had toyed with for a very long time. And it's easy to procrastinate on a side idea when you're kind of busy on your main quest. But then I got to a point where I was like, wait a second, somehow I'm in my mid-30s now. It's either now or never. And I just really buckled down to do it. I was And my wife and I were expecting our first kid. So I was like, things are going to get a lot busier once this changes. So I used that as a motivator. And it was quite an undertaking, I have to admit. I definitely underestimated it. Not in the sense of knowing that it was going to take a lot of work, but I wrote it all by hand to begin with. Not the text, but all of the notation. It's kind of like when you want to record, but you don't know how to use the DAW. You're like, oh, I want to just do it. And I don't know, how does the routing work? Why isn't this happening? And I didn't want to deal with that. So I kind of rationalized it by saying, okay, I'm going to get it all down on paper. And then when I do pick a notation software, that'll kind of be a round of editing, because obviously I have to kind of check my work as I input it into the software. So I rationalized it that way. If I write another book down the line, which I'd love to, I'll probably just do it straight into a computer. Not sure. Don't hold me to it. But it was a long process, because once you do that, you then send it off. Somebody else does the music engraving. Then they send it back and say, let me know if you catch any mistakes. And as you can see, the book is long, much longer than I thought. And here's what's funny. When I initially pitched this to Hudson, I had a whole other half of a sort of mock table of contents. They're like, this is at least 2 books, probably 3 worth of stuff that you want to do. So why don't we just take the first 4 chapters and call that a book, and then see where we end up afterwards? And that is precisely why there isn't a single groove in the book. Mm-hmm. You're like, based on what you're doing here, rudiments-wise and application, that is plenty of material. So I thought, I'm like, oh, this is going to be easier than I thought. And then 184 pages later, it was not.
Well, you said there's no grooves. I mean, there are a few of the audio examples towards the end when you speed them up. They could be like intros of songs with guitars over them. They sound pretty groovy.
Well, thank you. That was a big part of it. I didn't want anything to sound dry, and I didn't want to kind of milk the real estate on a page for the sake of it. I mean, look, we all grew up playing stick control at some point.
Sure.
But after a while, you're like, okay, I get it. It's great, but I don't need to displace every beat of everything and play it 20 times before doing the next one. And I've actually wanted to dive back into that book. It's been a long time, so don't think I'm talking shit. But there are so many books, though, where it's like, and now you can do it this way, and now you can do it that way. And I've said this before, it's great for coordination and seeing what's possible. But I wanted this book to be something where, like you said, it could be an intro to a song. It could be a fill. It could be a beat if you, I don't know, add bass drum to it in a certain way. So I'm glad you picked up on that. I knew you'd be the guy to talk to about this.
Well, I also noticed too, and full disclosure, I haven't even gone through the whole book because, as you know, I flew back from Pennsylvania last night, and you were kind enough to send it to me kind of beforehand. So I've been looking over it, and I've noticed it's mostly on the hands, is what I'm trying to say. So
yeah.
Is there more bass drum stuff in those other chapters, or is it just your creativity is really about formulating the hands and then having the bass drum be that sonic foundation behind it all?
Very good question, and here's the answer for you. It's twofold. So, with the lengthier chapters, and for anybody who's listening and wondering how the book is laid out, it's laid out into 4 sections. The first section is entirely at the practice pad. It's meant to be warm-ups, routines, getting the blood flowing, stuff that I play before going on stage. And a lot of this stuff were things that I would just do and not really analyze, and then think, okay, how would I actually put this on paper? So there's like the flat flams thing is one of my favorites, or these like single stroke patterns that are broken up in certain ways. So that's the entire first section. The second section, we move a lot of that to the drums. Third section is all things diddles, and that's the lengthiest part of the book. And then the last section is mixing up everything that we'd gone through. So the whole point is application. We start here, we move it to the drums, we develop it, and then here's how we put everything together. Now, in the lengthier chapters, now I said there are 4 sections, and those are subdivided into 40 chapters. But the lengthier chapters, when there were exercises that I knew could be milked into more and more and more variations without getting out of hand. But some of those longer chapters, I had to bring the feet in. But I didn't want to bring the feet in too much for 2 reasons. One, when you do that, you inevitably start bringing in a lot of double strokes. And while I'm a big fan of a strong right foot and using double strokes and triplets and all that kind of stuff. I didn't want there to kind of be a barrier to entry. So there is some of that in there, but I didn't want somebody to look at it and be like, oh, I'm trying to focus on the rudiments themselves, and I don't want to also focus on my feet. So when the bass drum is brought in, it is typically later in those chapters. But I do say somewhere in the text, I say two things. If you want, you can hit the bass drum every time you hit a tom. And that makes it very, very fill-like because, as you know, there's nothing more satisfying than playing a hard fill but doubling your toms with a bass drum, and it just feels like it's nothing but oomph, right?
Sure.
So that is something that you can do. And then taking that a step further, you can substitute the toms with a cymbal on either side plus the bass drum. So all of that ties into this idea of creativity, and I wanted to kind of give an insight into that because it does pain me when people are so focused on just recreating what's on paper. That's the difference between learning and then practicing. And to me, practicing is not just nailing the thing 20 times and saying, okay, I've got it. You have to do something with it. And that is a theme throughout the entirety of the book. Okay, now try it this way. If it doesn't feel particularly musical, try to think about it like this. And in the text, I tried to write it as if I was seated across from a practice pad with a student and how I would explain it. So I hope that came across, but there you have it.
What is your view on books like this as opposed to the online instructional course vibe that seems to be kind of has a stronghold on a lot of drummers these days?
Anything educational I find very important, and I think it's excellent. And when I go back to my youth I talk about some of the classic drum solos tapes that Hudson put out back in the day, or the Modern Drummer festivals and that kind of stuff. I'm sure you as well went to Guitar Center and said, ooh, I want to buy that one. And you go watch it. And back then, I don't know about you, but I definitely wasn't hauling a VCR and a giant tube TV next to the drums. So I would kind of have to like watch something, get inspired, and then go play. These days with laptops and phones, being able to just kind of sit there with headphones on or in-ears, watch something, play along with something, it's amazing. I don't want to say past that point in my life because that sounds pretentious because I love to learn, but I do like the sort of solitude of sitting down at the instrument with the music stand, plopping the book down, being like, all right, I'm going to work on this chunk today. Mm-hmm. And the only drawback I can possibly think of and this isn't even a drawback, this is just something that I would like people to be aware of, is that you and I both know that you can have 5 drummers play any exercise in that book, and they will all sound different. I feel like a lot of the stuff online, and this is based on what I stumble across, so I could be way off here, but it's all about precision, especially when you are, let's say, playing to a little notation graphic, and you want to make sure that all the beats are bang on so that the audio and video are correlating. That's fine and dandy, but there's a robotic element to that. And I feel like when people look at something on paper, they're kind of bringing it to life rather than replicating what they're watching on YouTube. Mm-hmm. Both are great, but there is an inherent element of individuality when you are reading notes. You don't know how they sound until you play them. And then you go, oh, okay, I see what I can do with this.
Well, and you were saying that you did have a whole other half of the book that is not being printed. So is the goal to make that second book? Should people get this book now? I'm trying to sell your books. Should they get this now so that when you do release another one, they're not behind? Is that the plan?
That is the plan. And if people want me to write a second book, they should definitely buy the first one, because then I think, okay, somebody actually wants this. I'll keep going. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a funny thing because, you know, the experience of you record a song and by the time it's actually done and out in the world, you never want to hear it ever again.
Of course.
It's the same with the book. By the time I recorded that audio, it was the last thing I ever wanted to do. I was like, I'm done. You edited it. I approved it. Now I got to record these audio examples. But honestly, it was a lot of fun. I wouldn't call myself an engineer, but I've got this little Gretsch bop kit, one of those Brooklyn series ones. It's great. But I did a little 4-mic Andy Johns setup. Sounded really good, and I was happy with it. So I did have
really good. Yeah.
Thank you. So I did have fun doing it, but yeah, that was the end. It's like, let's get these audio examples, and that's the final thing. You know, now that it's out, I do want to do more. I've never put a book out into the world. I've put many songs out that feel like the second they're out, they're old news, and books require a lot more commitment. So we'll see how it goes, but I've been filled with pride seeing people post their copies that they arrive for all the, pre-order people. That made me feel good, but it's a big undertaking.
Well, speaking of the audio examples, just listening to them, it almost sounds like a splice pack. I mean, it sounds like, I'm curious how many, I don't even know if it's legal, if it's like, people can use them in songs, but it's fills that you actually want to hear in songs. It's not just, and again, I don't want to be the guy that's like promoting your book, so I'm just going to keep hating on other books, but a lot of the audio examples.
That's totally fine. That's A-okay.
Okay.
Except for Mark Giuliana's book, because that man is a gem, and he's the one who facilitated the whole relationship with Hudson.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Love Mark. But yeah, you actually want to use these. In other books, sometimes the audio examples, it's like, okay, now I can hear what they're trying to say on the paper. But when you're driving home, you're like, but I'm not going to use this. So it's immediately, you can use these exercises to make music. It's not like an esoteric thing.
Well, I thoroughly appreciate that. And that was honestly the point. And here's some examples of books that I love and that were integral to my having learned how to read as a young drummer after already having been playing for a few years.
Sure.
But the Jim Chapin book is excellent. And for first timers, it's kind of a lot of puzzle pieces because okay, I got to do the jazz rhythm on the ride that everybody knows. I got to keep the hi-hat on 2 and 4. I personally did not like keeping quarter notes on the bass drum. But it's like you have those two things that cannot change. And then your snare and your bass drum have to do whatever's on the page. So it's a great coordination book, whether you care about jazz or not. And I can honestly say at the time when I was going through it, I didn't. I just played what was on the page because that's what the teacher told me to do. But it became definitely one of my favorites, especially as I naturally started appreciating guys like Joe Morello and that kind of groove. Funky Primer. I don't know if you ever went through that one.
I do. Currently kind of in and out of it, yeah.
I loved it, but what I loved about it is that it was very clear to read. Kick, snare, hi-hat, it's a great thing to practice reading to. Nothing in there is too difficult. And I think if that book were any longer, it may feel like, oh, okay, I get it. Because a lot of the stuff in that book, if I recall correctly, I could be wrong, but it's like, okay, here's the beat. And now we're going to add an extra bass drum. And then next time we're going to add 2 extra bass drums.
Holy
and then you get
shit.
Then you get to the point where like, okay, I see what's going on here. It's kind of, And I wanted to avoid that thing just because all of those great classic books have already done that. And I mean, they're classics for a reason. So if you want that, go get Funky Primer, Jim Chapin, and Stick Control and all that fun stuff. Future Sounds was a lot about displacement.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. That's its main focus.
Yeah. So I don't think you'll find a better book at that than Future Sounds, right?
Sure.
And, what is also tough is finding out what your book would bring to the table. So for anybody who's interested in this sort of thing, it's important to find out what you don't want your book to be, and that will help kind of point you down a certain path. I always encourage people to take whatever they can from anything and use it in a way that benefits them, that suits them. That's the point of everything.
And also in this book, you don't necessarily talk about, like so many instructional books start off with grip and how to hold the sticks and stuff. Do you have any views on that when you're talking to people? Is that the first thing you talk about? Or are you pretty liberal with that stuff?
I am very liberal about that stuff. Now, I do talk about, okay, so the very first chapter in this book, in this practice pad section we talked about, It's called One Hand at a Time. And this is literally stuff to get the blood pumping. And then throwing accents in there. And I talk about, okay, if you're feeling tense, slow down, focus on this. And like I said, that's where the approach of, if I was sitting across from a practice pad teaching somebody, this is what I would tell them if I saw them tensing up or struggling. So I talk about what your wrist should feel like. If you're feeling tension here or there, it's probably because of this. Mm-hmm. But I also didn't want it to sound like I didn't want it to look like some anatomical diagram of like, here's what you should look like. Sure. Because everybody holds sticks differently. Everybody's technique is different. And really, as long as you're not tensing up or hurting yourself, your technique is generally fine. Okay. And you have to find out, okay, if you can't progress your doubles faster than a certain tempo, and you should be able to, okay, that's a technique thing. It may not be a grip thing per se.
Sure.
And I know a lot of people really harp on that stuff, and I get it. Perhaps I just naturally had technique that was able to evolve over time. I mean, I can see things from when I was a kid. I was like, oh, the way I look playing the drums has changed over time. So regardless of what you learn in that respect, it will evolve because you will do things that feel more and more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say this. I mean, obviously you're aware of the way the sticks feel because you obviously choke up, you like longer sticks. So you know how you want the stick to feel in you. So you do respect it, but you're not overanalyzing it like some people do.
Yeah. Well, you notice everything, the long sticks, the choking up, but that's exactly right. And really, I mean, look, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it here, but technique is really so that you can play freely. You mm-hmm. can't play freely if you're holding on to a stick for dear life, and you will hurt yourself doing that. Mm-hmm. So I think as long as you're playing and you're aware that you shouldn't be tensing up, then you'll kind of be able to avoid it and refine yourself as time goes by. Now, this is a crazy thing, pivoting from drums really quickly. Speaking of technique, and like I said, being aware being the most important thing, I had a vocal lesson with this phenomenal vocal coach, incredible woman, and I asked her, I was like, why in God's name would I hit a pitchy note when I know the note I'm supposed to sing and I have a good ear? Why? Why would a wrong note come out of my mouth? And she said, here, let's just sing some stuff. And she's like, well, your pitch is good, but I can hear that you carry a lot of tension in the back of your tongue. And I'm like, how are you hearing that? She's like, look, I study this at school. It's like a curse that I can literally hear how people are producing sound. So I can hear that you're holding tension in your tongue. And obviously your tongue is attached to everything around your throat and vocal cords. Even though you're hearing in your head the note that you were going to sing, if you're tense and it's even in the most minute way tugging on that, you will be pitchy. So now, hearing that, I can feel like, ooh, yes, I have tension in the back of my tongue right now. There are a lot of things like that people would never think about. And I don't blame them for not thinking about them. I was just like, I didn't even know that tongues had tension, right? And but
I always knew that, for the record.
Yeah. But as a drummer, it maybe I'm just being dismissive, but it seems like common sense. You're holding on to these wooden poles, and you're either doing it tightly or you're not. And when you realize that you shouldn't be holding them tightly, that's a big realization to make. And I think from that point forward, knowing you should be relaxed is very important.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Everyone, I'll have a link in the show notes to go get this directly after listening. It's very affordable for how much it's probably going to change your drumming. It's a great deal. It's a beautiful looking book. You got a nice little upside down Ilan on the front as well.
I should have called it the duality of drumming and just made it a really philosophical experience with that photo there. That photo was from either the first or second show I played with Danny Elfman.
So were these at the Bowl, or am I making that up?
No, those were at the Bowl.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, dude, like I said, I mean, I'll reiterate it. I don't think there's a book out right now of a contemporary drummer doing things at the level that you're doing them and that are giving people practical things they can use immediately on the gig that they do the night after they start practicing this for the first time. I'm really excited to have you on and dive into this as just a drummer, not even a podcast host trying to help you sell books.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I know you just came back from a tour, I think yesterday.
Yes.
Right? So the fact that you were able to jump in and do this, I appreciate it. And it's always a good time talking to you.
Dude, ditto, man. I got to say, I want to show you. And that's the show. If you're listening on a platform that allows ratings and reviews, do that. It helps more people find the show, so it'll get bigger and better, and hopefully I'll have a chance to sell out one day. But you'll be an OG listener that can brag to all your friends. Anyways, why don't you go and check us out at bigfatsnaredrum.com and follow us on all the socials. Just search for Big Fat Snare Drum, and you will find us. The show is edited in part using Isotope RX Audio Editor. It's amazing, so go check that out at isotope.com. And thanks again to Gunnar Olsen for the theme music. Bye!